The waters of the Pacific Ocean welcomed back the four humans who traveled farther than anyone in the history of our species. The Artemis II mission has ended successfully, and they are finally home. But the image of the Orion capsule slowly descending beneath its massive parachutes is deceptive. Because behind that calm, almost silent scene lies one of the most terrifying, violent, and precise maneuvers ever executed by humanity. 4 people, 1 capsule, 40,000 kilometers per hour, 4 people traveling wrapped in fire. Because returning from deep space doesn't mean coming back. It means falling. It means facing the most lethal invisible wall on the planet, our own atmosphere. Think about it for a second. Faster than a bullet, faster than a fighter jet, faster than any machine ever built by human hands throughout all of recorded history. And then, colliding with air. At those speeds, friction is no longer friction. It becomes an inferno. The Orion capsule was surrounded by temperatures approaching 2,000 degrees Celsius. Let me give you some perspective on what that actually means. Nearly half the temperature of the surface of the sun, almost 3 times hotter than volcanic lava. Hot enough to vaporize most metals within seconds, and 4 humans were sitting just centimeters away from that wall of fire. The entire spacecraft disappeared inside a sphere of plasma, fire, and blinding light. From the ground, you couldn't even see it. Just a streak of white across the sky, like a falling star. Except this falling star had people inside. And at the center of that inferno, 4 astronauts trusting their lives to a next-generation heat shield. A shield that had never before been tested at these exact velocities, at this exact angle. Under these exact conditions, there was no margin for error, not a second, not a millimeter, not a single degree. Because this maneuver, known as skip reentry, doesn't just demand precision, it demands perfection. Here's what it looks like. Imagine throwing a flat stone across the surface of a lake. If you throw it right, it skips, bouncing off the water before finally settling in. If you throw it wrong, it sinks immediately. Now, replace that lake with Earth's atmosphere. Replace that stone with a spacecraft traveling at 11 kilometers per second. And replace your hand with a computer system making thousands of calculations every single second. If the capsule enters the atmosphere even slightly too steep, the heat and pressure would destroy it in milliseconds, not minutes, milliseconds. The crew would have no warning, no time to react. It would simply be over. But if it enters too shallow, the spacecraft would bounce off the upper atmosphere like that stone skipping across water and vanish forever into the cold darkness of deep space. No second chance, no rescue mission. Gone. That is how thin the line was between coming home and being lost forever. On April 10th, 2026, humanity witnessed 11 of the most intense, dangerous, and spectacular minutes in the history of human spaceflight. 11 minutes that most people watched without fully understanding what they were seeing. So let's change that. Let's understand exactly how NASA managed to execute the hottest, most precise, and most dangerous atmospheric descent in over 50 years, and bring its crew home alive. Because what we saw floating peacefully over the Pacific was not just a capsule returning from space. It was an engineering miracle, decades in the making. To understand the true scale of this achievement, you first have to forget everything you think you know about how the Apollo missions returned. Back in the 1960s and 70s, the engineers at NASA were brilliant, but they were also working with the technology of their era. Apollo capsules came back in the most brutal, direct way possible. They fell almost like meteors. No skipping, no bouncing, no second pass. They entered the atmosphere directly, taking the full force of friction, deceleration, and heat in one single violent, unforgiving moment. It was raw. It was aggressive. It pushed the limits of what materials science could handle. It worked, barely, but it worked. Now, 50 years later, humanity is going back to deep space, and this time, we're coming home smarter. Astronauts could experience up to 7 times the force of gravity, crushing their bodies deep into their seats. 7 times. Think about what that means. If you weigh 70 kilograms on Earth, in that moment, your body feels like it weighs nearly 500. Your chest compresses, your vision narrows, your arms feel like they're made of concrete. It felt like an enormous, invisible weight pressing down with no mercy, making it hard just to breathe, just to stay conscious. And yet, they had to remain alert, ready, in control, because their lives depended on it. But the physical punishment wasn't the only problem Apollo faced. They depended entirely on something completely outside their control. The weather, storms, strong winds, rough ocean conditions, any of it could turn a textbook landing into a nightmare in minutes. The capsule could drift far from the target zone, slam violently into the surface of the ocean, or scatter across such a wide area that rescue operations became dangerously difficult. 50 years ago, NASA's most powerful enemy wasn't the vacuum of space. It was a storm in the Pacific. But with Orion, NASA changed the rules entirely. Engineers developed something that, when you first hear it, sounds more like science fiction than aerospace engineering: skip reentry. The concept at its core is simple, elegant even. Remember skipping a flat stone across water as a child? Finding just the right angle, the right spin, watching it bounce once, twice, 3 times across the surface before finally settling in? That's exactly what Orion did. Except instead of bouncing on water, it bounced on the Earth's atmosphere itself. As the capsule descended to approximately 120 kilometers above Earth, it collided with the first thin layers of air. And in that instant, that fraction of a second, the heat shield absorbed a force that defies imagination. Thousands of degrees, extreme pressure building faster than any furnace ever designed. Friction so violent it turned the air itself into glowing gas. But instead of continuing straight down into the thickest layers of atmosphere, Orion did something extraordinary. It used its own shape and the resistance of the air pushing against it to generate lift. Yes, a spacecraft returning from deep space flew. For a brief, breathtaking moment, the capsule actually climbed again. It skipped. It pulled away from the most lethal layers of the atmosphere, gaining precious seconds to shed heat, to breathe, to survive, like pulling your hand away from an open flame just before it burns. That single controlled bounce accomplished 3 things simultaneously. It reduced speed, it lowered heat buildup on the shield, and it prepared the capsule for a far more controlled final descent. But here's what makes skip reentry truly revolutionary. It wasn't just about surviving the heat. It gave the onboard computer something that Apollo never had: control. The ability to extend or shorten the flight path by thousands of kilometers in real time, adjusting to conditions as they changed. That means NASA no longer crosses its fingers and hopes for calm seas. Now it can choose, with surgical, almost arrogant precision, exactly where on the surface of the Earth the capsule will land. And thanks to that maneuver, Orion guided itself with quiet confidence directly toward a pre-selected recovery zone in the Pacific Ocean, where a U.S. Navy vessel was already in position, already waiting, already ready. A perfect choreography between fire, physics, and human ingenuity. But while the capsule performed this dance of fire high above the clouds, on Earth, something else began. Something that no engineer, no training simulation, no technology on the planet can make easier. The most terrifying part of the entire mission. As Orion burned across the sky like a second sun, the screens at Mission Control went dark. Because when a capsule hits the atmosphere at those speeds, the physics change in a way that is almost cruel. The air around the vehicle stops behaving like air at all. It stops being gas. It becomes plasma, a superheated, electrically charged state of matter that wraps around the capsule like a second skin, glowing white, blinding, absolute. And that plasma acts like an invisible wall between the crew and everyone trying to protect them. It blocks every radio signal, every data stream, every frequency. For those minutes, Mission Control cannot hear the crew, cannot receive telemetry, cannot track the capsule's position, cannot know if the heat shield is holding or failing. They know nothing. And the silence feels endless. Imagine having the most advanced technology ever assembled by human civilization at your fingertips. Satellites in orbit, sensors spanning continents, supercomputers running millions of calculations per second, antennas pointed at the sky from every corner of the planet. And in the single most critical moment of the entire mission, none of it matters. You cannot reach them. All you can do is sit in that room. Watch the seconds tick by on the clock. Feel the weight of 4 lives pressing down on your shoulders. And trust. Trust the shield. Trust the math. Trust the thousands of engineers who spent years making sure this moment would work. Trust that when the plasma finally fade, you'll hear their voices again. Because in those moments, every second feels like an eternity. And there is something else that no one at NASA can ever forget. Something that lives in the back of every engineer's mind, every flight director's nightmare. Every astronaut's quiet fear, the ghost of Columbia. February 1st, 2003. The Space Shuttle Columbia was coming home. A small piece of foam, no larger than a briefcase, had struck the leading edge of the wing during launch. A damage so seemingly minor that some engineers weren't even sure it mattered. It mattered. During re-entry, superheated plasma found that tiny wound in the thermal protection system and tore through it like paper. Columbia disintegrated at nearly 60 kilometers above Earth. 7 astronauts gone, and for several agonizing seconds at Mission Control, they didn't fully understand what they were seeing. The data simply stopped. That is why every communication blackout carries weight that words cannot fully describe. Because at those speeds, it only takes one failure, one broken tile, one faulty sensor, one fraction of a degree in the wrong direction. And a spacecraft can disappear from the sky before anyone on Earth has time to react. That memory lives in every room at Mission Control, in every calculation, every test, every sleepless night before a launch. It is the reason the heat shield on Orion was tested to extremes that seemed almost obsessive, because they know what happens when it fails. And then, after minutes that feel like entire lifetimes, a signal returns, faint at first, then stronger, then unmistakable. A voice, confirmation. Orion survived the inferno. The crew is alive. And in that room full of the most composed, disciplined professionals on the planet, people wept. But the mission is not over, because now comes the final challenge, the last danger, standing between 4 astronauts and the moment they can finally breathe. Stopping a 10-ton machine, still moving at enormous speed before it hits the surface of the ocean. The capsule has survived fire, plasma, silence, the ghost of history. But it is still falling. And even though it is no longer traveling at 40,000 kilometers per hour, it is still moving fast enough to turn splashdown into catastrophe. Now begins the most delicate phase of the entire return. In just a matter of minutes, Orion must transform from a supersonic projectile into something that can safely carry 4 human beings to the surface of the water. It sounds almost impossible, It's like trying to stop a falling fighter jet using only fabric, ropes, and air. At approximately 7 kilometers altitude, Orion activates the first stage of its braking sequence. 2 small drogue parachutes deploy with a crack like a thunderclap, not to stop the capsule, not yet. Their job is subtler and just as critical: to stabilize, to orient, to wrestle the capsule from chaos into something resembling order. The pull is violent. The entire structure shudders. The lines stretch to their absolute limits, vibrating like guitar strings under impossible tension. For a few breathless seconds, Orion hangs suspended between chaos and control, between falling and floating. And then comes the moment that stops your heart. 3 massive main parachutes explode open against the sky. Enormous, each one covering a surface area larger than most houses. Together, they span nearly the width of a football field, a vast canopy of red and white hanging above the Pacific like a declaration of victory. The transformation is instant, almost surreal. Minutes ago, this object was a fireball visible from hundreds of kilometers away. Now, it drifts, slowly, quietly, almost peacefully. Speed drops from something unimaginable to just 32 kilometers per hour at the moment of impact. The capsule hits the water, it splashes, it tilts, it sways in the swells of the Pacific. But it holds. Flotation systems inflate immediately, large airbags surrounding the capsule, keeping it upright and stable on the surface. Within minutes, U.S. Navy helicopters are overhead. Fast boats cut through the water. The recovery ship, exactly where the math said it would be, moves in with practiced precision. Hatches open. 4 faces appear in the sunlight. Everything worked perfectly. But what just happened in the skies above the Pacific Ocean was more than a return from space. It was a proof of concept for the next chapter of human civilization. Because Orion is not simply a spacecraft. It is a machine designed to carry human beings beyond everything we have ever known, beyond the orbit of the moon, beyond the comfortable neighborhood of Earth. And unlike the Apollo capsules, which flew once, splashed down, and were placed in museums, Orion is reusable, built to fly again, built for the long journey ahead. Artemis II didn't just prove we could reach deep space again, it proved we could come back. With better navigation, smarter heat protection, more precise control, more robust recovery systems, decades of hard lessons folded into every component. We went further, we came back safer, we proved the architecture works, and now the world is already looking ahead to Artemis III. Docking systems tested in lunar orbit, landing vehicles validated, the full chain of technologies that must work flawlessly in sequence before the most anticipated moment in a generation, the return of human footprints to the surface of the moon. But this time is different. This time, we are not going to plant a flag and leave. We are not visiting. We are going to stay. To build habitats, to mine resources, to understand what it takes for human beings to live, not just survive, on another world. To use the moon not as a destination, but as a launch pad for the dream that has lived in the human imagination for centuries. Mars. For decades, deep space exploration felt like something that belonged to the past. Grainy black and white footage, history book photographs, a chapter that had closed. But on April 10th, 2026, that chapter reopened, not with nostalgia, not with a tribute to the past, with something new, something faster, something smarter, something built for what comes next. Artemis II sent 4 human beings farther from Earth than anyone had traveled in over 50 years, and it brought them home. That is not a small thing. That is everything. Because every impossible journey in human history began exactly the same way, with someone who looked at the horizon and refused to accept that it was the end. Humanity is back in deep space, and this time, we're not leaving.